Rain hammered against the dormitory windows when Felix whispered, "I can smile for the whole world, Hyung, but not for you anymore." The words were so soft that they should have disappeared beneath the thunder. Instead, they struck Hyunjin harder than any scream ever could. Hyunjin stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still wrapped around the silver doorknob, rainwater dripping from the ends of his black hair onto the wooden floor. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Felix was sitting on the edge of his bed, shoulders trembling, blonde hair falling into his eyes like curtains hiding a wound that had been bleeding for too long. The room smelled of wet clothes, vanilla lotion, and the faint lavender scent Felix always sprayed onto his pillow before sleeping. For a moment, neither of them moved. Felix lifted his gaze. His lips curved into that familiar angelic smile, the one he gave to staff members, fans, strangers in elevators, and children who waved at him from the street. But when he looked at Hyunjin, the smile vanished. Nothing remained but exhaustion. Hyunjin felt his throat tighten. He had known this moment was coming. He had feared it for months. And still he was completely unprepared. The first time Hyunjin met Felix, he thought the younger boy was too bright to be real. Felix laughed with his entire body. He smiled even when he was nervous. He apologized when someone else stepped on his foot. He cried over injured birds and saved every voice memo Hyunjin sent him. There was a warmth around Felix that made people instinctively move closer. Hyunjin had been one of them. At first he told himself it was simple admiration, then friendship, then dependency, then something far more dangerous. Felix became the first person Hyunjin looked for in every room, the first person he texted after midnight, the first person whose silence could ruin an entire day. But Hyunjin had secrets that grew like thorns around his heart. Years before meeting Felix, he had learned that loving someone too deeply always ended with loss. His father had left without saying goodbye. His first love had chosen fame over sincerity. And Hyunjin, despite all his elegance and confidence, had developed a quiet terror of being abandoned. So when he realized he loved Felix, he panicked. He smiled, he joked. He kept Felix close enough to touch but never close enough to stay. Felix, meanwhile, loved openly. He remembered how Hyunjin liked his coffee. He saved the corner seat for him during rehearsals. He placed small handwritten notes inside Hyunjin's sketchbook. "Eat well, sleep more, you did amazing today. I'm proud of you." Hyunjin treasured every note yet pretended they were ordinary. When fans teased them about their closeness, Felix blushed. Hyunjin laughed it off. When Felix rested his head on Hyunjin's shoulder during long flights, Hyunjin let him. But he never turned to kiss the blonde strands from Felix's forehead. He never said the words burning in his chest. He never asked for more. And over time, Felix began to understand. Hyunjin wanted him. But he was too afraid to choose him. The realization hollowed Felix from the inside. He smiled brighter in public. He laughed louder around the others. He became the son everyone adored. But every time he looked at Hyunjin, his light dimmed, because Hyunjin was the only person whose love Felix could feel and the only one who refused to name it. The breaking point arrived 3 nights earlier. They were at an after-party celebrating a successful comeback. Music thundered through the room. Cameras flashed. Champagne sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Felix stood near the balcony, his silver jacket catching the light like stardust. Hyunjin was talking to a famous actress who rested her hand on his arm and laughed at every word he said. Felix watched from across the room. He told himself it shouldn't hurt. After all, Hyunjin owed him nothing. No promises had ever been made. No confessions had ever crossed the space between them. And yet when Hyunjin looked over and smiled politely, as if Felix were no different from anyone else in the room, something inside Felix shattered. Later that night, Hyunjin found a small envelope tucked into his coat pocket. Inside was a folded note in Felix's careful handwriting. "You don't have to love me back, but please stop making me hope." Hyunjin read the words 5 times, then he ran to Felix's room, but the door was locked. And for 3 days, Felix avoided him. He smiled at everyone else. He complimented Changbin's new song. He teased Han over breakfast. He thanked staff with his usual sunshine. But when Hyunjin entered the room, Felix's expression became neutral, distant, polite. It was a colder pain than anger. Hyunjin realized he would rather be screamed at than ignored. So on the 4th night he stood in Felix's doorway, soaked by rain and guilt. "I'm sorry," Hyunjin said. Felix let out a brittle laugh. "For what?" "For pretending." Looked down at his hands. His fingers were wrapped around a tiny dragon keychain Hyunjin had bought for him years ago. The edges were worn smooth from constant touch. "I loved you so loudly," Felix whispered. "And you loved me so quietly that I started wondering if I imagined it." Hyunjin crossed the room slowly as if approaching a frightened animal. "I was afraid." Nodded. "I know." "No," Hyunjin said, voice shaking. You don't understand. I thought if I told you I would ruin everything. His eyes glistened. And what did you do instead? The question sliced through him. Hyunjin sank to his knees in front of Felix. The polished floor was cold beneath him. I ruined you. Closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down his cheek. Hyunjin reached up but stopped before touching him. I love you, he said. The confession emerged ragged and broken as though it had clawed its way through years of fear. I have loved you in every quiet way a coward can love someone, in every sketch. In every sleepless night. In every moment I pretended not to care while caring more than I knew how to survive. Felix's lips trembled. Then why did I feel so alone? Hyunjin's own tears fell freely now. Because I thought protecting myself was safer than trusting you. Rain outside softened to a whisper. Felix stared at him for a long time. His freckles were visible beneath the warm bedside lamp, scattered across his cheeks like tiny constellations. Hyunjin had drawn those freckles dozens of times. He knew everyone. I waited for you, Felix said. I know. I defended you when others said you were emotionally unavailable. Hyunjin let out a choked sob. I know. I loved you even when it hurt. I know. Inhaled slowly. And I'm tired. The words were not cruel, they were honest. Hyunjin bowed his head. For the first time he understood that love was not only about confession, it was also about timing. And sometimes truth arrived after someone had already exhausted their strength. Felix lifted Hyunjin's chin, their eyes met. I still love you, Felix admitted. Hope flared painfully in Hyunjin's chest. But love doesn't erase what happened. Hyunjin nodded. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. Studied him. Then what are you asking? Hyunjin placed his trembling hand over Felix's, for a chance to become someone who doesn't make you feel lonely. Stretched between them, not empty, not hostile, simply fragile, Felix searched Hyunjin's face for signs of uncertainty, for hesitation, for the familiar fear that had always stood between them. But this time Hyunjin did not look away. Finally, Felix's shoulders relaxed. He slid from the bed onto the floor until they were sitting face to face, close enough for their knees to touch, close enough to hear each other breathe. Felix rested his forehead against Hyunjin's. The contact was feather-light yet overwhelming. I don't need perfection, Felix murmured. Hyunjin closed his eyes. Then what do you need? Felix's voice cracked. I need you to stay. Hyunjin wrapped his arms around him carefully, as if holding something both precious and breakable. Felix melted into the embrace. For several minutes they said nothing. The storm passed. The room grew quiet except for the sound of two hearts finally beating in the same rhythm. When Felix pulled back, his cheeks were wet. But for the first time in months he smiled at Hyunjin. It was small, tender, real. Hyunjin stared at that smile as if witnessing sunrise after a lifetime of darkness. I missed that, he whispered. Felix brushed away Hyunjin's tears with his thumb. Then don't give me a reason to hide it again. Hyunjin kissed him, softly, not with urgency but with reverence. Years of unsaid words dissolved in that single touch. When they separated, Felix laughed through his tears. You're late. Hyunjin pressed their foreheads together again. I know, smiled wider. But you're here. Outside, the clouds parted, revealing the first pale hints of dawn. Golden light slipped through the curtains and painted the room in warm amber. Hyunjin looked at Felix, the boy who smiled for everyone, except the person he loved most. And he understood the truth that would stay with him forever. The saddest smiles are often reserved for the people who matter the most, because they are the only ones with the power to break us. But when love is finally spoken with courage instead of fear, those same smiles can become the beginning of healing. Felix kissed Hyunjin once more, gentle and certain. This time when he smiled, he did not look away. Morning arrived quietly, like a secret neither of them wanted to disturb. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains and stretched across Felix's bed, painting his blonde hair with a golden glow. He was asleep again, his breathing slow and even, one hand still tangled in the sleeve of Hyunjin's sweater, as if his body refused to risk losing him. Hyunjin did not move. He sat against the headboard with Felix curled against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of the younger boy's heartbeat. For years, Hyunjin had imagined what it would feel like to wake up with Felix in his arms. In every version of that fantasy, he felt happiness. He had never expected to feel fear. Not the fear of rejection. That fear had vanished the moment Felix kissed him back. This was something deeper. A sharp, humbling awareness that he had been trusted with the most delicate part of another person's heart, and he had almost destroyed it. Felix stirred just after 8, his eyelashes fluttered. For a moment he looked disoriented, as though he thought the night before had been another one of those dreams where Hyunjin finally chose him. Then his eyes lifted, their gazes met. The memory returned all at once, the confession, the tears, the kiss, the promise. A blush spread slowly across Felix's cheeks. Good morning, Hyunjin whispered. Felix's lips curved into a sleepy smile. This time it was meant only for him. Good morning. The words were soft, but they wrapped around Hyunjin's heart like silk. He brushed a strand of blonde hair away from Felix's face. How are you feeling? Felix considered the question carefully. Tired, he admitted. Hyunjin's chest tightened. I'm sorry. Shook his head. I didn't say that so you'd apologize. He reached up and traced the dark circles under Hyunjin's eyes. You look worse than I do. Hyunjin laughed under his breath. I haven't slept. Tilted his head. Why? Because I was afraid you'd disappear if I closed my eyes. Hyunjin swallowed the thought before it escaped. Instead he said, I wanted to make sure you were still here. His expression softened. I'm here. Pressed a kiss to Hyunjin's jaw. The contact was brief, but it sent warmth flooding through Hyunjin's body. Then Felix sat up and hugged his knees to his chest. The room was suddenly quieter. The kind of quiet that follows after an emotional storm when the sky is clear but the ground is still soaked. Hyunjin sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Felix broke the silence. What happens now? Hyunjin had asked himself the same question dozens of times over the past few hours. The honest answer was that he didn't know. They were not stepping into a fairy tale. They were stepping into the aftermath of years of silence and hurt. And love alone could not erase that history, but it could be the beginning. Hyunjin turned toward Felix. Now I prove that last night wasn't just words. Felix's eyes searched his face. How? By staying when things are difficult, by telling you the truth even when I'm afraid, by choosing you in ways you can actually feel. Lowered his gaze, his fingers tightened around the blanket. That sounds beautiful. Hyunjin sensed the hesitation in his voice. But, Felix exhaled shakily. But I'm scared to believe you. Confession was barely louder than a breath, yet it carried the weight of everything Felix had endured. Hyunjin took his hand. You should be. Looked up surprised. Hyunjin squeezed his fingers gently. If I were you, I'd be scared too. A tear formed in the corner of Felix's eye. You're not angry. No. Hyunjin brushed the tear away with his thumb. I'm grateful that you're still willing to try. Leaned into his touch. I don't know how to stop loving you. Hyunjin's voice trembled. Then let me learn how to love you properly. A knock on the door startled them both. Changbin's voice came from the hallway. You two alive? We're ordering breakfast. And Hyunjin exchanged a look. Then unexpectedly Felix laughed. The sound was bright and warm and impossibly familiar. Hyunjin felt his heart lift. Felix called back. We're coming in a minute. Changbin muttered something about dramatic people before his footsteps faded. Felix turned back to Hyunjin. The laughter slowly disappeared, replaced by nervousness. Are we telling them? Hyunjin smiled. Only if you want to. Bit his lower lip. His freckles stood out against his flushed cheeks. I think I want this to be ours for a little while. Hyunjin touched his forehead to Felix's. Then it will be. They dressed slowly, moving around each other with a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty. Every accidental brush of their hands sent sparks through both of them. At one point, Felix reached for his hoodie and Hyunjin caught his wrist. Felix turned. What is it? Hyunjin stepped closer. I just wanted to do something I've wanted to do for a long time. Breath caught. Hyunjin knelt and tied the younger boy's shoelaces. Felix stared down at him, eyes glistening. When Hyunjin stood again, Felix whispered, You remember I always forget. I remember everything about you. Kissed him before either of them could say another word. The kiss tasted like mint toothpaste and fragile hope. When they entered the kitchen, the members were already gathered around the table. The room smelled of coffee, toast, and fried eggs. Han was laughing at something Sumin had said. Lino was scrolling through his phone. Bang Chan looked up first. His eyes moved from Felix's flushed face to Hyunjin's softened expression. A slow smile spread across his lips. Well, he said, reaching for his coffee, it's about time. Nearly choked. Hyunjin blinked. Han burst into laughter. I knew it. I told you 2 years ago, Sumin added calmly. Changbin pointed at them with a piece of toast. You owe us all dinner. Covered his face with both hands. Oh my God. Hyunjin laughed so hard he had to hold onto the back of a chair. The tension that had haunted them for months dissolved into something lighter, something almost ordinary. And perhaps that was the most miraculous part. Love, after all, was not built only in dramatic confessions and midnight kisses. It was built in breakfast rooms, in shared glances, in shoelaces tied and coffee poured, in staying. Later that evening, after rehearsals and interviews and 100 small moments where their fingers brushed in secret, Felix and Hyunjin returned to the rooftop of the dorm. The city stretched below them, glittering with thousands of lights. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. Felix leaned against the railing. Hyunjin stood beside him. Neither of them needed to fill the silence. After a while, Felix spoke. Do you know what hurt the most? Hyunjin turned to him. Felix kept his eyes on the skyline. I thought my love was something you had to recover from. Hyunjin's heart clenched. He stepped closer until their shoulders touched. Love was never the problem. Looked at him, moonlight reflected in his dark eyes. Then what was? Hyunjin took a slow breath. Fear of deserving it. Reached for his hand, their fingers intertwined. You do deserve it. The certainty in Felix's voice was so absolute that Hyunjin felt tears sting his eyes. He pressed a kiss to Felix's knuckles. I'm still learning to believe that. Smiled. Then I'll remind you until you do. Wind lifted strands of blonde and black hair around their faces. Below them the city kept moving. Cars passed, lights changed, people laughed and cried and fell in love. But on that rooftop time seemed to pause. Hyunjin cupped Felix's face in his hands. I love your smile, he whispered. Felix's lashes fluttered. Even when it's not for you. Hyunjin shook his head. Especially when it is. Smiled then, not for the world, not for cameras, not for anyone else, only for the person he loved most. And this time Hyunjin was brave enough to smile back.
The days that followed did not feel like a dramatic transformation. There were no orchestras swelling in the background, no magical certainty that erased the years of misunderstandings between them. Instead, there were small, trembling moments. And somehow, those moments felt more meaningful than any grand confession. 3 days after their first kiss, Felix woke to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the soft scratching of pencil against paper. He blinked against the pale morning light and found Hyunjin sitting by the window, sketchbook balanced on his knees. His dark hair fell over his eyes, the tip of his tongue pressed lightly against his lip, a habit he had whenever he concentrated. Felix smiled sleepily. What are you drawing? Hyunjin looked up. For a brief second, the old reflex appeared in his expression, the instinct to hide what mattered most. Then he caught himself. He stood, crossed the room, and handed the sketchbook to Felix. On the page was Felix, not the polished version fans saw on stage, not the dazzling idol with flawless makeup and practiced poses. This Felix was curled beneath a blanket, hair tousled, freckles visible, one hand tucked beneath his cheek. At the bottom of the drawing, Hyunjin had written in careful letters, "The safest place I know." Felix's vision blurred. He traced the words with trembling fingers. "You're really trying," he whispered. Hyunjin sat beside him on the bed. "I'm done loving you in secret." Turned and kissed him, slow and lingering, with the kind of tenderness that made the world outside disappear. When they pulled apart, Hyunjin rested his forehead against Felix's. "I know trust doesn't come back overnight," nodded. "Every time you choose honesty," Hyunjin continued, "I'll choose it too." Heart felt impossibly full. For the first time in years, hope no longer felt dangerous. It felt like home. That evening, the group attended a live broadcast. The studio was crowded and bright. Cameras glided silently across the floor. Staff hurried past carrying cue cards and bottles of water. Felix was surrounded by familiar chaos, smiling warmly as always. But every few minutes his eyes drifted toward Hyunjin. And every single time, Hyunjin was already looking at him, not furtively, not with the hesitation that once defined them, openly, steadily. As if he no longer feared being seen. During a break, Felix stood near the monitor checking his mic pack. A young stylist approached Hyunjin, laughing as she fixed the collar of his jacket. Months ago, a scene like this would have planted a seed of silent insecurity in Felix's chest. Tonight he watched calmly, not because jealousy had vanished, but because trust was beginning to take root. Still, when Hyunjin noticed Felix observing them, he excused himself immediately and crossed the room. Without a word, he slipped his pinky around Felix's hand behind the monitor where no cameras could see. A tiny gesture. Simple, quiet, yet Felix felt his throat tight. Hyunjin leaned close enough that Felix could feel his breath against his ear. "I'm here," words, that was all. But Felix understood everything they meant. "I choose you, I want you to know. I'm not hiding anymore." Felix squeezed his hand. "I know." Later that night, after schedules ended and the dorm grew still, Felix found Hyunjin on the living room floor surrounded by sketches. Moonlight spilled across the pages. Every drawing was of Felix. Felix laughing with his head thrown back, Felix asleep in a car, Felix eating strawberries, Felix crying, Felix smiling, Felix looking at Hyunjin with unmistakable love. Felix sank to his knees beside him. "You kept all of these." Hyunjin's ears turned pink. "I drew them whenever I missed you." Turned another page, there were hundreds, years of hidden devotion captured in graphite and ink. "Why didn't you show me?" Hyunjin stared at his hands. "If you saw how much space you took up in my heart, you would have known I was terrified." set the sketchbook aside and cupped Hyunjin's face. Hyunjin, their eyes met. I never needed you to be fearless. Hyunjin's lower lip trembled. Felix brushed his thumb across it. I only needed you to let me love you. A tear slid down Hyunjin's cheek. Felix kissed it away, then another, and another, until Hyunjin was laughing softly through his tears. He pulled Felix into his lap and held him as though he had finally been granted permission to stop pretending. The night stretched around them, quiet and forgiving. At some point, Felix spoke into the curve of Hyunjin's neck. Do you know what I love most about you? Hyunjin tightened his arms around him. What? Felix smiled. You feel everything so deeply. Hyunjin let out a shaky breath. I used to think that was my weakness. Leaned back to look at him. It's the reason your love feels like art. The words settled in Hyunjin's chest, filling old wounds with warmth. For years, he had treated his emotions as something dangerous, something to conceal. But in Felix's eyes, his vulnerability was not a flaw. It was beautiful. Weeks passed. Their relationship unfolded gradually, like dawn spreading across a dark sky. They still argued sometimes. Felix occasionally withdrew when old hurts resurfaced. Hyunjin sometimes overthought and feared he would fail. But now they spoke. They apologized. They stayed. And with each difficult conversation, trust grew stronger. One evening, after a long rehearsal, Felix and Hyunjin sat alone in the practice room. Sweat dampened their shirts. The mirrors reflected two exhausted figures leaning shoulder to shoulder. Felix rested his head against Hyunjin's. Do you ever regret telling me? Hyunjin turned immediately. Never. Studied his expression carefully. Not even if I had said no. Hyunjin took Felix's hand and kissed his knuckles. Loving you honestly is worth any answer. Felix's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the quiet certainty of being loved without conditions. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his eyes, the same smile he gave to everyone, but deeper, softer, more intimate, reserved for the person who had finally learned how to treasure it. Hyunjin touched his cheek. There it is. Blinked. Favorite smile. Laughed. Then he kissed Hyunjin under the bright fluorescent lights of the empty practice room, surrounded by mirrors that reflected them from every angle. For once, neither of them looked away. Because some love stories are not about finding the right person. They are about becoming brave enough to love that person out loud. And as Felix smiled into the kiss, Hyunjin understood that the greatest masterpiece he would ever create was not a drawing. It was a life where Felix never had to hide his smile again. Winter arrived with a quiet kind of magic. The first snowfall came during a late-night recording session. Tiny flakes drifted past the studio windows, soft and luminous under the city lights. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of coffee, cables, and the faint sweetness of the tangerines Felix always kept in his bag. Felix was in the vocal booth when he noticed it. Hyunjin, he said through the headphones, his voice crackling gently through the speakers. Look. Hyunjin turned toward the glass snow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Felix's smile bloomed, bright and unguarded, the kind that transformed his entire face. Years ago, Hyunjin might have admired that smile from a distance and convinced himself it was enough. Now he stepped into the booth, wrapped his arms around Felix from behind and rested his chin on the younger man's shoulder. Your first snow since we became us, Hyunjin whispered. Felix leaned back against him. Then we should make a wish. Hyunjin kissed the side of his neck. I already got mine. Turned, eyes warm and impossibly soft. You're getting better at saying things like that. Hyunjin smiled. You make it easy. Laughed and tucked his face into Hyunjin's chest. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in white. Inside, something in both of them felt equally transformed, clean, quiet, new. By December, their relationship had become an open secret. No official announcement was ever made, but the members stopped pretending not to notice. Bang Chan grinned whenever Felix unconsciously reached for Hyunjin's hand. Han composed dramatic songs about forbidden lovers who finally got their act together. Seungmin claimed he was relieved the tension in the dorm had decreased by 80%. Even Lee No, who rarely commented on anyone's romance, muttered one evening, "You're both less annoying now." Considered that a heartfelt blessing. For Hyunjin, the greatest change was not public or dramatic. It was internal. The fear that once defined him had not vanished completely. Some nights he still woke with his heart pounding, convinced he would somehow ruin everything. On those nights, Felix would sit up, wordlessly wrap his arms around him and stroke his hair until his breathing steadied. "I'm here," Felix would murmur. The same words Hyunjin had once used to reassure him. Now they belonged to both of them. And each time Felix said them, Hyunjin believed a little more that love did not have to be temporary. One snowy evening near Christmas, Felix invited Hyunjin to his room. There were fairy lights strung along the walls and a candle burning with the scent of cinnamon and cedar. A small wrapped box sat on the bed. Felix shifted nervously from foot to foot. "I know it's early," he said, "but I wanted to give this to you before things get busy." Hyunjin sat beside the gift. His fingers trembled slightly as he untied the ribbon. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook. The cover was embossed with tiny stars. When Hyunjin opened it, he found a handwritten note on the first page. "For the artist who taught me that love can be drawn in 1,000 quiet ways, thank you for finally letting me live inside your heart. Love, Felix." Hyunjin had received awards, letters, and countless gifts over the years. Nothing had ever affected him like those words. His vision blurred. Felix sat beside him, suddenly anxious. "You like it?" Hyunjin turned and kissed him before he could finish the sentence. When they separated, tears shimmered in Hyunjin's eyes. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received." I felt visibly relieved. "I wanted to give you something you'd use." Hyunjin brushed his thumb across Felix's cheek. "I'm going to fill every page with you." Freckles stood out as he blushed. "Then I guess I'll have to stay close." Hyunjin laughed softly. "You're not getting rid of me now." Climbed into his lap, arms circling his neck. "Good." They sat like that for a long time, the candle flickering nearby, snow tapping gently against the window. Eventually, Felix grew quiet. Hyunjin sensed a shift in his mood. "What are you thinking about?" Felix traced the collar of Hyunjin's sweater. "Last year, I told myself I needed to stop hopping." Hyunjin held him tighter. Felix looked up. "I thought loving you would always be lonely." His voice was calm, but emotion shimmered beneath every word. "Now," Felix smiled, "now it feels like coming home." The words struck Hyunjin with such force that he could not speak for several seconds. When he finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. "You are my home too." Kissed him slowly with the tenderness of someone who understood exactly how hard-won this happiness had been. On New Year's Eve, the members gathered on the rooftop to watch fireworks. The city stretched endlessly below them, alive with lights and anticipation. As midnight approached, laughter filled the cold air. Felix stood beside Hyunjin wrapped in a long cream-colored coat, his fingers tucked into Hyunjin's gloved hand. 10, 9, 8. The countdown echoed from surrounding buildings. 7, 6, 5. Hyunjin turned to look at Felix instead of the sky. 4, 3, 2, 1. Fireworks exploded overhead in brilliant cascades of gold and crimson. The members cheered. But Hyunjin heard only Felix's breath, only the quiet wonder in his eyes, only the heartbeat of the person who had changed his life. "Happy New Year," Felix whispered. Hyunjin touched his face. "Happy New Year, my love." Then he kissed him under a sky full of light. The kiss was warm despite the winter air, steady despite the years it had taken to reach this moment. When they parted, Felix was smiling, not the bright smile he gave to cameras, not the practiced smile he offered to the world, but the intimate smile that belonged solely to Hyunjin, a smile that carried forgiveness, trust, and a future neither of them feared anymore. Hyunjin pressed his forehead to Felix's and closed his eyes. For so long, he had believed love was something fragile, something destined to disappear. But standing there with snow melting in Felix's hair and fireworks illuminating the night, he finally understood another truth. Real love was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to stay despite it. And as the first moments of a new year unfolded around them, Felix smiled for the person he loved most. This time, the smile did not hurt. It healed. Spring arrived almost without warning. The snow melted from the rooftops. Cherry blossoms unfurled along the sidewalks in delicate shades of pink. Warm air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of rain and flowers and new beginnings. For Felix and Hyunjin, life settled into something they had once believed was impossible, peace, not a perfect peace. They still worked exhausting schedules. They still argued over small things, forgotten messages, missed meals, nights when one of them was too tired to speak. They still carried old fears inside them. But they no longer faced those fears alone. Love became woven into the smallest parts of their lives. In the way Hyunjin always saved the last strawberry for Felix. In the way Felix rubbed circles on Hyunjin's back when he was anxious before performances. In the notes they tucked into each other's bags. In the quiet certainty that, no matter how chaotic the world became, there was one person waiting at the end of every day. 1 year after the night everything changed, Hyunjin asked Felix to meet him in the art studio he had rented in secret. The room was filled with sunlight. Canvases lined the walls. The scent of paint and paper hung in the air. Felix stepped inside and stopped. Every wall was covered with portraits of him. Felix laughing in the kitchen. Felix asleep by the window. Felix dancing under stage lights. Felix crying and smiling and dreaming. Years of love surrounded him in color and graphite. At the center of the room stood one final painting, hidden beneath a white cloth. Hyunjin took Felix's trembling hands. "I spent so long loving you in silence," he said. "I wanted to spend the rest of my life loving you where you can see it." Eyes were already wet. Hyunjin pulled away the cloth. The painting revealed the two of them on the rooftop on New Year's Eve, foreheads touching beneath a sky of fireworks. At the bottom of the canvas, Hyunjin had painted a single sentence, "Your smile became my home." Felix covered his mouth as tears spilled down his cheeks. Hyunjin sank to one knee, his voice shook, but his eyes never wavered. "You were patient when I was afraid. You stayed when I gave you reasons to leave. You taught me that love is not something to hide from." Opened a small velvet box. Inside was a simple silver ring. "Felix, if you still want me on the difficult days and the beautiful ones, through every fear and every joy, will you stay with me for the rest of our lives?" For a moment Felix could not speak. The room blurred behind his tears. He remembered every lonely night, every hidden hope, every smile that concealed heartbreak. And he remembered the man before him, the one who had finally chosen honesty over fear and transformed love into something safe. Felix dropped to his knees and threw his arms around Hyunjin. He sobbed. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Hyunjin laughed through tears as he slipped the ring onto Felix's finger. Felix kissed him with all the tenderness and gratitude his heart could hold. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying and smiling at once. The months that followed were filled with celebration, quiet planning, and the steady joy of building a future together. On their wedding day, the sky was clear and bright. Cherry blossoms drifted through the air like soft pink snow. Their closest friends and family gathered in a garden washed in golden sunlight. When Felix walked toward him, Hyunjin felt the same overwhelming certainty he had felt the first time Felix smiled at him without pain. This is home. They exchanged vows with trembling voices and tearful laughter. They promised to speak honestly, to stay through fear, to protect each other's hearts, to choose one another every day. When the ceremony ended, they kissed beneath a shower of petals while the people they loved cheered around them. Years passed. Their hair grew a little longer, then a little silver at the temples. Their lives changed in countless ways. But some things remained beautifully constant. Felix still smiled at everyone, at neighbors, at friends, at strangers. And every evening when he returned home, he saved his softest, truest smile for the person who had once been too afraid to accept it. Hyunjin never took that smile for granted again. Sometimes he would pause in the doorway just to look at Felix and remember the night those words first shattered him. "I can smile for the whole world, Hyung, but not for you anymore." The pain of that memory never disappeared completely, but it no longer carried regret. It carried gratitude, because it had forced him to become brave. It had taught them both that love is not measured by how intensely we feel, but by how faithfully we stay. Many years later, on a quiet spring evening, they sat together on the porch of the home they had built. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. Felix rested his head on Hyunjin's shoulder, their fingers intertwined exactly as they had been on countless nights before. "Do you know," Felix said softly, "I used to think my smile was too fragile for you." Hyunjin kissed his forehead. Now, Felix turned to him. His freckles were softer with age, but his eyes still held the same warmth that had changed Hyunjin's life. "Now I know it was always safest in your hands." Hyunjin smiled through tears. "And my heart was always safest in yours." Smiled then. the same radiant smile that had once hidden sorrow, the same smile that now held only peace. And as twilight settled around them, Hyunjin understood that some love stories do not begin with certainty. They begin with fear, with mistakes, with almost losing everything. But when two hearts are willing to be honest, patient, and brave, love can transform even the deepest wounds into something beautiful. Felix smiled for everyone. But the smile he gave Hyunjin was different. It was softer, truer, full of a lifetime of forgiveness and devotion. And Hyunjin, who had once been too afraid to reach for that smile, spent the rest of his life protecting it. The end.